There comes a moment in the life of every true empath when something inside them goes completely still. Not broken, not bitter, not hurt, just closed. This silence doesn't manifest as an emotional breakdown, nor as ordinary exhaustion. It emerges when everything that once reacted, absorbed, and gave itself away simply stops responding. And that's precisely what terrifies those watching from the outside. If you've ever felt this happening inside you, if something about these words is already pulling at something deep in your chest, then this video was made for you. And if you're not yet subscribed to this channel, I invite you to subscribe now, because we're about to go on a journey into one of the most misunderstood stages of psychological and spiritual development. This isn't surface-level content. This is the kind of truth that changes how you see yourself forever. Carl Jung observed that this state wasn't depression, nor was it emotional coldness. He identified something far rarer, a final stage of spiritual awakening that only appears after a long inner journey. When the empath reaches this point, something changes forever. They don't become cruel. They don't lose the ability to feel. They become untouchable, and that completely transforms the dynamics around them. For most of their life, the empath has lived as an open channel. They walk into a room and immediately sense the psychological climate. They feel unspoken tensions. They catch pain no one has voiced. Family gatherings leave them drained, not from what was said, but from what had to be silently held. Friendships exhaust them because they carry both sides of every conflict. Romantic relationships nearly destroy them because they feel their partner's pain more intensely than the partner does. Jung called these people the emotional buffers of their social systems. They didn't just have compassion for suffering, they absorbed it. They metabolized it. They transformed it so others could keep functioning. Parents dumped their anxieties on them. Siblings used them as silent therapists. Partners treated them like permanent emotional support, as if their very existence had the function of regulating the inner states of others. And the most disturbing aspect of Jung's observation is that these empaths rarely complained. They accepted this role as destiny. They believed their sensitivity was an obligation, that caring for others, even at the cost of their own peace, was a sign of spiritual worth. They wore exhaustion like a badge of virtue. Suffering in silence seemed like proof they were good people. From a young age, they were praised for understanding too much, for smoothing over conflicts, for swallowing their own needs to maintain collective balance. Every time they erased themselves, they received approval. Every time they absorbed someone else's pain, they were called mature. And so a deep pattern of self-abandonment was born, disguised as kindness. But Jung recognized something even they couldn't see in that moment. This pattern couldn't last forever, and when it finally breaks, the empath doesn't scream. They don't accuse, they simply go silent. And that silence marks the point of no return, when sensitivity stops responding. Have you ever felt like you gave too much of yourself to people who never truly saw you? That quiet ache when you realize your care wasn't reciprocated, it wasn't even noticed? Maybe you're standing at that threshold right now, and you don't even know it yet. For most of their life, the empath believes that feeling is who they are. Not a choice, but an identity. Feeling too much, perceiving too much, carrying what isn't said. All of it seems natural, inevitable, almost biological. From a young age, they understand the world through emotions, not just their own, but the feelings of others that arrive without permission, crossing their boundaries and settling in as if they were their own. For a long time, this sensitivity functions as the central axis of the psyche. It guides decisions, relationships, silent choices. The empath learns to navigate the world by reacting. They adjust. They soften. They anticipate pain that hasn't even occurred yet. They become skilled at perceiving emotional microfractures, subtle shifts in tone, invisible tensions. And the more they recognize, the more they believe this ability is their mission. But there's something rarely said. No psychic function is born to dominate the soul forever. Extreme sensitivity isn't an end point. It's a profound, necessary, but temporary phase. It exists to lead consciousness into inner regions few ever reach. Regions where the common ego cannot survive without dissolving. The empath traverses these regions because they feel too much. because they cannot protect themselves from collective pain, because they don't know how to close the inner doors. But feeling too much takes its toll. Over time, something begins to shift. Not dramatically, not as a collapse, but as an almost imperceptible change. The empath notices they're no longer reacting with the same intensity. Situations that once triggered an inner whirlwind now pass like distant echoes. They still notice, they still understand. But something no longer moves inside them. This is a critical moment, and one that's deeply misunderstood. To those on the outside, it seems cold, it seems like distance, it feels like a loss of empathy. But internally, something else is happening. Sensitivity has stopped commanding. It hasn't disappeared. It has withdrawn. Carl Jung observed that in advanced stages of individuation, the psyche stops identifying with its initial dominant functions. What was once the center of identity now takes a secondary place, not because it was suppressed, but because it has already fulfilled its purpose. The empath doesn't lose the ability to feel, they lose the urge to react. And that difference is enormous. Reaction is automatic. It's the soul trying to maintain coherence with an old identity. When reaction stops, something new emerges. Presence. An inner state that doesn't need to move to prove its existence. A silence that isn't empty, but full of integration. At this stage, the empath begins to experience something they've never had before. Guilt-free emotional neutrality. They realize they can be present without absorbing. They can witness without carrying. They can love without sacrificing themselves. And that completely disrupts the world around them. Because people weren't used to their presence. They were used to their reaction. When sensitivity stops responding, many feel helpless. Not because the empath has become indifferent, but because they've stopped maintaining imbalances that were never theirs to hold. They no longer function as an emotional buffer. They no longer absorb blows that don't belong to them. This moment isn't chosen. It happens when the internal system reaches an invisible threshold. That's where true silence begins. And that's exactly where the empath crosses the first threshold of the final stage. The invisible separation between who you were and what's coming happens before the empath finally stops caring. Something breaks inside them. It's not a conscious decision. It's not a moral choice. It's not a deliberate act of defense. It's an invisible fracture between two identities. The old identity was built over years of adaptation. It emerged in childhood, when the empath realized it was safer to feel others than to assert themselves. When they understood that understanding brought approval. When they learned that silencing their own pain brought peace to those around them. This identity worked. For a long time, it guaranteed belonging, acceptance, even a kind of social value. The empath was considered special, sensitive, deep, reliable, someone who could handle it. But this identity had a hidden price, the slow dissolution of the inner center. Over time, the empath begins to feel a fatigue that isn't physical, a burnout that can't be solved with rest. It's the exhaustion of maintaining a psychic structure that no longer matches what the soul has become. This is where the fracture begins. The old identity still tries to react. It still tries to care. It still tries to feel like before. But something no longer responds. Emotions don't disappear. They stop ruling. The empath realizes they can feel without losing themselves. They can observe without interfering. They can be present without dissolving. This shift is silent but profound. Carl Jung described this process as a separation between the old ego and the deeper center of the psyche, a necessary break so individuation can reach its mature form. At this stage, the ego that has defined itself through emotional reaction is no longer capable of grasping the totality of the emerging self. The empath experiences this as a growing inner distance. They're still there, but they no longer recognize themselves in the automatic responses of before. They no longer feel urgency to explain. They no longer need to be understood. Something inside them is organizing itself in silence. And that's precisely what others perceive, even without knowing how to name it. They sense something has changed. They try to provoke old reactions. They expect emotional explanations that no longer come. They mistake silence for contempt. But what's happening is something else. The empath has crossed the invisible separation. This fracture marks the end of empathic identity as the center of the psyche. It's not a loss. It's transition. The soul stops functioning through excess and begins functioning through integration. The shadow, previously projected through guilt and victimhood, begins to assimilate. The empath understands without words that they no longer need to pay with suffering to exist. And when that happens, something ends definitively. Because those who go through this fracture don't return to the previous stage, not because they don't want to, but because they can no longer inhabit a psychic form that has become too small. It's at this precise point that the empath begins to stop caring, not out of indifference, but because something more solid has taken over. The loneliness that doesn't ask for company arrives after the invisible separation. The empath enters a solitude that doesn't want to be filled. It's not forced isolation. It's not rejection of the world. And it's definitely not sadness. It's a loneliness born from inner coherence. Throughout their life, the empath has been surrounded by people. Even when physically alone, they were never alone internally. They carried the voices, feelings, expectations, and pain of others. Their psyche was a space many inhabited, and that created the illusion of constant connection. But as the final stage begins, this inner space empties itself, not of meaning, but of noise. The empath realizes they no longer want to share everything, not out of fear, not because of trauma, but because certain inner experiences don't require witnesses. They discover there are processes that dissolve when spoken aloud, and intuitively, they begin to protect them with silence. This is the birth of mature solitude, a solitude that doesn't demand company, that doesn't require validation, that doesn't want to be explained. Carl Jung observed that in the most advanced stages of individuation, the individual naturally withdraws from the collective, not out of contempt, but because the center of gravity of the psyche has shifted. The orientation is no longer external. The soul is no longer organized by the gaze of the other. The empath begins to feel uncomfortable in environments where they once adapted easily. Superficial conversations ring hollow. Other people's dramas lose their pull. There's no judgment, just an absence of resonance. And that confuses people around them. They interpret this withdrawal as coldness, arrogance, or superiority. But the empath doesn't feel superior. They feel out of sync with an emotional rhythm that no longer matches their inner state. Solitude becomes the only space where the psyche remains whole. At this stage, the empath discovers something unsettling. Many relationships only existed because they cared too much. When that excess disappears, artificial bonds dissolve on their own. There's no fight. There's no explicit separation. Just increasing silence. And that silence no longer hurts like before because now it's not experienced as abandonment, but as alignment. Solitude that doesn't ask for company is an unmistakable sign of psychic maturity. It shows the empath no longer needs to lose themselves to feel connected. They learn to be with themselves without fear, without urgency, without a sense of lack. And that changes their presence in the world. They become more reserved, more attentive, less emotionally available. Not out of defense, but out of completeness. The energy once distributed is now concentrated. This is a stage few reach because it requires overcoming the empath's primal fear, the fear of not being needed. When that fear disappears, solitude stops being a threat. It becomes territory, and those who inhabit this territory don't return to the old state of emotional fusion. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself in these words, if you've been feeling this pull toward solitude and wondering if something is wrong with you, I want you to know nothing is wrong. You're not broken, you're transforming. And if this resonates with where you are right now, take a moment and leave a comment below. Just share one word that describes what you're feeling. Sometimes naming it is the first step to understanding it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. This community is for people like us, people who are willing to look at the uncomfortable truths of inner transformation. There's a silent test that precedes the final stage of spiritual awakening. It doesn't appear as an external challenge. It doesn't involve visible conflict. And it offers no recognition whatsoever. It's an internal test and invisible. Few speak about it because almost no one notices when they're crossing it. Yet Jung observed that all people who reached deep integration pass through the same threshold. The moment when the world stops emotionally reacting to their presence. Before, the empath provoked reactions. People opened up. They vented. They projected. The empath was sought out, asked for, emotionally summoned. Their presence triggered something in others. Suddenly that stops. People no longer demand. They no longer seek. They no longer react like before. Not because of conscious rejection, but because something in the empath's psyche has stopped sending the same signal. This is a deeply unsettling moment. The empath silently wonders if they've missed something essential, if they've stopped being who they were, if they've failed at their invisible mission. But Jung knew this is the test. The test is to remain whole, even when the world stops mirroring your former identity. Here, many retreat. They try to restore the old role. They start caring excessively again. They resume emotional absorption. They force connections that no longer resonate. All to avoid the emptiness that emerges when empathic identity is no longer externally reinforced. But those who cross the threshold don't do that. They endure the silence without filling it. They endure the lack of response without interpreting it as failure. They endure invisibility without trying to prove their worth. Carl Jung understood this test separates those who are still dependent on external reflection from those who have already found a stable inner axis. It's the moment when the old ego dies quietly, not from pain, but from irrelevance. Nothing external validates this crossing. There's no applause. There's no confirmation. There are no witnesses. The soul simply reorganizes itself. The empath realizes they can exist without emotional function, that they don't need to be useful to be whole, that they don't need to carry to belong. And when that understanding anchors, something fundamental ends. The old identity doesn't return. The old sensitivity doesn't rule. The old role doesn't call anymore. This is the moment when the empath definitively stops caring. Not because they've closed off, but because they've passed the test that few survive without falling apart. There's a precise moment, even if it can't be located in time, when empathic identity stops carrying the psyche. It's not a breakdown. It's not a crisis. It's a quiet completion. For years, the empath believed their sensitivity was the center of their being. That feeling for others was who they were. This identity was reinforced through stories, praise, expectations, and subtle guilt. It was cemented as an essential role, the one who understands, the one who welcomes, the one who endures. But every role-based identity has an expiration date. When individuation approaches its final phase, the psyche begins withdrawing energy from structures that no longer serve the whole. And empathic identity, built on reaction, absorption, and sacrifice, becomes too small to contain what the soul has become. This is the moment of symbolic death. There's no public mourning. There are no goodbyes. There are no witnesses. The empath simply realizes they can no longer inhabit this version of themselves. Old emotional reactions feel artificial. The urgency to care finds no inner support anymore. The impulse to give dissolves before it completes. This causes a deep strangeness, because empathic identity wasn't just a behavior, it was a sense of existence. When it dies, a void initially emerges. Not a depressive void, but a space not yet named where nothing requires immediate response. Carl Jung understood this phase as dissolution of the functional ego, an ego organized to survive and belong but no longer capable of carrying the totality of the integrated self. Here, many try to revive the old role. They try to feel like before. They try to care like before. They try to reclaim the old pain because at least it was familiar. But the psychic body no longer responds. The death of empathic identity is not a decision. It's a consequence. It's the natural result of a soul that has integrated too many experiences to continue reacting automatically. At this stage, the empath begins to notice something unsettling. They no longer recognize themselves in the narrative of too sensitive, not because they've become insensitive, but because sensitivity is no longer the central axis. They still notice, they still understand, but it doesn't dissolve them. Other people's suffering no longer crosses their inner boundaries. They observe, recognize, and remain whole. That generates no guilt. It creates no inner conflict, only observation. And that changes everything, because the empath discovers they can exist without emotional function, that they don't need to carry to justify their presence in the world, that they owe nothing to collective pain to deserve space. This realization marks the definitive death of empathic identity as a way of being. What comes after isn't empty, it's structured silence. And this silence prepares the stage for something even rarer. Have you noticed yourself pulling back from people you once would have rushed to help? Do you feel guilty about it, or does it feel strangely like relief? I'd love to know where you are in this process. Leave a comment and share what's happening inside you right now. And if you know someone going through this exact transformation, someone who might feel alone in it, share this video with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is help someone feel less alone in their awakening. After empathic identity dies, something fundamentally reorganizes. This something is not visible, it's not explainable, and it seeks no expression. It's the silence that emerges after shadow integration. For a long time, the empath's shadow consisted of everything they couldn't be: anger not shown, boundaries not imposed, desires silenced, instincts contained in the name of harmony. The shadow was fed by constant self-abandonment. But contrary to what many assume, this shadow doesn't manifest as explosive aggression in the final stage. It doesn't emerge to confront the world. It gets assimilated, integrated. The empath stops projecting their shadow through guilt, victimhood, and excessive care. They acknowledge without dramatization that they too possess hardness, distance, and indifference, and that doesn't make them less whole. This integration produces a profound effect: emotional silence. Not defensive silence, not resentful silence, but the silence of those who no longer need to react to protect themselves. The psyche enters a state of rare stability. Emotions arise, pass, and leave no trace. External circumstances no longer cause disproportionate inner waves. There's unprecedented psychic economy. The empath feels less, and that's not a loss. It's precision. Each emotion now carries real weight. Nothing gets amplified through unconscious projection. Nothing gets absorbed without inner consent. The shadow previously responsible for constant emotional flux has been integrated into the whole. And with that, the need to care decreases dramatically. The empath doesn't care not because they've become cold. They don't care because they have nothing left to prove. The urgency to respond disappears. The need to be understood dissolves. The obligation to maintain artificial bonds ends. The silence that emerges after shadow integration is frightening to those still living in emotional chaos. It gets interpreted as distance, superiority, or disinterest. Internally, however, it's experienced as deep alignment. This silence has weight. It has density. It has presence. Within it, the new identity emerges. An identity not defined by empathy, but by wholeness. Not based on pain, but on boundaries. That doesn't react to the world, but notices it. At this stage, the empath recognizes something crucial. There's no way back to the old way of living. Not because they reject the past, but because they no longer fit in it. Silence is not the absence of life. It's life without dispersion. And when this silence settles, the process enters its final phase, the birth of a rare identity. After the silence that settles with shadow integration, something new begins to form. It doesn't come as excitement. It's not a revelation, and it demands no recognition. It's an identity born without a name. For a long time, the empath was defined by what they offered: care, listening, presence, absorption. Their identity was relational. It existed for the sake of the other. Even when they tried to distance themselves, they still revolved around the need for emotional connection. But after the death of empathic identity, This logic stops operating. What emerges in this place is neither hardness nor pathological isolation. It's a centered identity, a way of existing no longer anchored in reaction, but in inner coherence. The empath feels they exist from the inside out, no longer from what they awaken in others. This identity is rare because it cannot be taught, imitated, or accelerated. It only emerges after all attempts to be needed have failed. After the empath understood, in the body and not the intellect, that they don't need to occupy a role to be whole. Here, something fundamentally changes in their movement through the world. They speak less, not out of caution, but because there's no excess. They explain themselves less, not out of pride, but because they no longer feel the need to be understood. They choose precisely where to place their energy, not through strategy, but through natural psychic economy. This new identity doesn't want to belong. It simply is. Carl Jung described this phase as consolidation of the self, a point where the psyche stops fluctuating between personas and reactions and begins operating from a stable inner axis. There's no more need for emotional compensation because there's no more fragmentation. The empath becomes increasingly perceived as different. Some feel discomfort in their presence, others feel respect without knowing why. There are those who sense distance. There are those who sense silence. But almost everyone notices something about them no longer exists the way it did before. And that's not arrogance. It's the end of the cycle. The rare identity born here is not defined by empathy, spirituality, or sensitivity. It's defined by quiet presence, natural internal limits, by an authority that doesn't need to assert itself. The empath no longer automatically enters other people's emotional fields. They no longer let themselves be crossed by pain that doesn't belong to them. They observe, recognize, and remain whole. This state generates no euphoria. It generates sobriety. A sobriety many mistake for coldness, but which is actually advanced psychic maturity. The soul no longer disperses trying to maintain external equilibriums. It stands on its own. Here, the empath recognizes they've become something other than what they were before. Not better, not superior, but irreversible. The old identity no longer calls. The old world no longer seduces. The old dynamics no longer function. The empath doesn't need to announce this transformation. It manifests in how they occupy space, in the silence they carry, in the absence of needs. And this birth marks the beginning of the final phase, the point of no return of spiritual awakening. There's a specific point in the empath's process that allows no return. It's not marked by extreme suffering. It doesn't come with external rupture, and it leaves no visible traces. It's the moment when the empath definitively stops caring, not about life, not about meaning, but about what previously demanded automatic emotional response. At this stage, something fundamental ends: the inner obligation to react to the world. The psyche no longer feels responsible for maintaining external emotional states. The empath no longer feels drawn to dramas, expectations, or projections. This generates no void. It generates clarity. The empath realizes they can be present without interfering. They can love without sacrificing themselves. They can observe without absorbing. They can exist without carrying. And this perception doesn't come as a decision. It installs itself as a state. The point of no return is not an event. It's an irreversible internal restructuring. The old psychic structure can no longer be reactivated. Even if the empath tries to care like before, something doesn't respond. The body doesn't follow. Emotions don't engage. Energy doesn't distribute. Here, many outsiders misunderstand. They say the empath has changed, that they're distant, that they're no longer the same, and they're right. What they don't recognize is that this change is not a loss of humanity. It's complete integration. The soul no longer needs to prove itself through pain. It no longer needs to assert itself through excessive empathy. It no longer needs to occupy the place of the world's emotional buffer. This is the final stage of spiritual awakening. There's no ecstasy. There's no grandiose mission. There's no reason to teach anyone anything. There's only quiet stability. The empath no longer seeks to be seen. They no longer seek to be understood. They no longer aspire to be necessary. They exist. And that existence alone changes everything around them. Because when someone stops caring in the old way, they become untouchable. Not from coldness, but because there's no other place to grasp. There's no more reactivity to manipulate. There's no more excess to exploit. The empath has crossed the point of no return. The journey doesn't end here, but the suffering does. What comes next cannot be explained. It can only be lived. When the empath stops caring, love doesn't die. It's the old identity that closes. After that, there's no going back. Only silence and presence remain. If you felt this shift happening inside you, if you recognize yourself in this journey, I want you to know you're not alone in this transformation. I'd genuinely love to hear where you are in this process. Leave a comment below sharing what resonated most deeply with you, or simply let me know if you felt that moment when you stopped caring in the old way. Your story matters, and it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this video spoke to something deep and true in you, I warmly invite you to subscribe to this channel. We explore these profound psychological and spiritual territories regularly, always with honesty, depth, and care. This is a space for people who are willing to look at the uncomfortable truths of transformation without turning away. And if you know someone who's going through this silent awakening, someone who might be feeling alone or confused by their own transformation, please share this video with them. Sometimes the most healing gift we can offer is simply helping someone feel seen and understood in their process. Thank you truly for staying with me through this entire journey. Thank you for having the courage to look at these difficult, beautiful truths about what it means to stop caring in the old way and start living from a place of wholeness. Your presence here, your willingness to go deep, it matters more than you might realize. Until we meet again, may you find peace in your silence and strength in your solitude.